Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tuesdays at 6. I am Raymond Nagem, Associate Director of Music at St. John the Divine.
And I'm Max Graff. I'm a composer, music teacher, and I guess Messiaen scholar. My doctoral research was about him, so I guess that's about where I'm at.
And welcome to this discussion about Messiaen's music. This is in preparation for a concert that's going to happen later tonight at 7 p.m. And I'm going to be playing Messiaen's La Nativité du Seigneur, or the Nativity of the Lord, from St. John the Divine. So, Max, tell us a little bit about how you got into Messiaen's music. I've always found that it's so striking and almost shocking in just the musical texture, and it to me it's had a huge impact. But tell us a little bit about how you got into this amazing sound world.
So, as an undergrad out at Indiana University, where I was about as familiar with Messiaen as you might expect from an undergrad. I knew the big pieces. I knew Quartet for the End of Time. I knew Taranga Lila. The big hits. But it never, at least back then, it didn't really grab me to the same extent that it seemed to grab a lot of other people. I had a little bit of trouble accessing it. What really what really made it click for me was when I was in Aspen in, I think, 2012, summer of 2012. And I heard the orchestra there do a live performance of Des Canyons aux Étoiles, which is, what, 1971,
Yeah, one
70
of the
something?
later works, right?
Yeah, later work of his, unbelievably striking. And what I realized when I heard that was that, at least for me, what really made Messiaen tick was hearing it live, and being part of the experience of the performance in real time. And to this day, listening to Messiaen on a recording doesn't do it for me in the same way that hearing a live performance of it does, just because of, and he said this himself. And this is maybe getting a little bit into what you might want to talk about later, but he said himself that, one of his primary goals was transferring that ritual liturgical experience into the concert hall. And I think a big part of that for him was actually physically being there in the concert hall to experience it. But
It
that's
definitely
maybe
does
getting
work.
ahead of myself.
Definitely does work as a cycle. I mean, hearing the whole thing, hearing La Nativité is about 55 minutes or so, and many of his other cycles are comparable in length. And hearing the whole work as a whole with all the movements in order, and maybe even looking at the texts in between each movement, I've always thought gave a whole nother dimension to the music rather than hearing little bits of it or watching it in segments.
Right. Yeah. He you know, reading what he wrote about his own music, he definitely conceived of his pieces, the larger ones, as disjointed as they might seem at first, especially some of the later ones. He absolutely conceived of them all as one unified whole, one longer narrative. I think that's especially true for La Nativité.
It's so interesting that you said that the Messiaen's music didn't strike you at first, or you had a little trouble getting into it. Because I was exactly the same way.
Mhm.
Growing up and growing up in the Catholic Church at a church with a great music program, St. Paul's Catholic Church in Harvard Square, I heard a little bit of Messiaen's music. Every so often, one of the organists there would play something. But whenever I heard it, I was really either confused or just I couldn't understand what was going on. And a lot of it is very sectional, so you have contrasting elements, and it doesn't stay with one particular thing long enough to kind of make a whole movement out of it. And I was so confused by it. And what really got me into it was a performance by my teacher Paul Jacobs at Juilliard. And after that, I went up to him and said, there's something going on here, and I'm not sure exactly what at this moment, but the way you play it, it's clear that this is music. There's really depth and meaning and power behind this music. So what should I do if I want to get into some of this? And he gave me a list of a couple pieces, and one of them was Nativité.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of I started listening to some CDs and old LPs, and then like it started to strike me after that. But it took a performance, and it was a performance, a live performance that really opened my eyes to
Yeah.
this crazy, amazing sound world.
What piece was it? Do you remember?
I think he was playing, and he wasn't playing a whole set. I think he was playing a couple of movements from the Livre du Saint-Sacrement, or the Book
Okay.
of the Holy Sacrament, Messiaen's last organ work. And
Yeah, isn't that the one that he wrote after saying he would never write anything as
yeah,
long as the opera again? Yeah.
yeah, no, he thought at the end of his life, I'm done with the organ. I've said all I have to say,
Yeah,
and
and then he writes a 2 hour long organ
then
piece.
he had 2 more hours left to go.
Hmm.
And very glad that he did. Um, yeah, so I also had this experience of like not really knowing what this was all about, and then my eyes were opened and I got into it, and then I just wanted to, once I got into the sound world, I just wanted to go further and further.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of thing that once you get your head around how it works, it's kind of hard to let go of. It's you can't have just one. It's very, very compelling and addictive once you get past the sort of very sort of esoteric nature of it, or that it can have anyway.
Yeah. So, what was your doctoral research? And tell us about your Messiaen research.
So it's sort of related to what I was talking about earlier. One of the things that's always really fascinated me about Messiaen is how effectively he's able to capture that ritual liturgical sort of experience in a concert context. And initially, what I'd wanted to do was dive a little bit deeper into like ritual theory, and see what kind of parallels that had with the structure of Messiaen's music. But what I wound up doing instead was looking at the last piece he finished, the Éclair sur l'au-delà, big orchestra piece, and looking at it as kind of a compendium or an encyclopedia of not just all the musical techniques he had been interested in over the course of his life, but also a lot of the philosophical ideas and religious theological ideas, and just looking at it as almost a valedictory statement from him.
Yeah, it's fascinating how he got very, very deep into really murky waters of theology. In some of his pieces, he's quoting liberally from Thomas Aquinas,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and
he loved Aquinas.
he's really getting kind of out there with deep subtleties of the relationship in the Trinity, between the persons of the Trinity, and all kinds of things. I think one of the things about Nativité is it's right at the beginning of his career, and because it's about Christmas, and everybody knows a little bit about the Christmas story. You walk past Saks Avenue and you see the little Christmas display and the crash and everything. It's a little bit easier as an entry, and which is probably why Paul would have picked that as the thing to maybe start with.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I like that piece too, because it's, to me, that piece is to his earlier years what Eclair is to his entire career. It's really kind of an encyclopedia. And you look at the book that he wrote in 45, explaining his own techniques, and it's full of quotes from La Nativité. There's other stuff too, but you really get this sense that it's a manifesto of the language that he's trying to build. But it's, at the same time, it's one of the more accessible sort of roots into his music, I think.
how do you think how do you think one would come about getting into Messiaen's music if you didn't have a deep Christian faith to start with, and what do you think that's a barrier to accessibility, or how would you
Well,
say that?
first of all, I don't think so at all because I'm not a particularly religious person. You know, I guess I can consider myself religion adjacent. My wife, as you know, is a Lutheran minister, and so I've been in the world for a while, but I don't consider myself to be religious. But at the same time, um, I think it for one thing, it speaks to a certain sort of truth about the way that humans experience rituals um, and the
We all have our
relationship of
rituals
a
of some sort, whatever they are, and
yeah
are things that bring us comfort.
right and the relationship of a the ritual or a liturgical experience to, for one thing, like linear time. He's very interested in suspending or subverting a sense of linear time, and for him in particular, a connection to God. um, and it's just there's certain things about the music that I think speak to that, regardless of what faith tradition you belong to or don't. Um, and in terms of coming at it from that direction, I think one of the things you can do is like I said, I think La Nativité is one of the better pieces to sort of start with. It's a really great entryway um, to his music, because it's full of these great tunes. It's super super melodic in a way that he sort of moved away from in later years. From about the 50s to the 90s or 80s, I guess, late 80s. Um, his music got much much more experimental and avant-garde and esoteric, before he very sort of publicly rediscovered his love of like melody at the very end of his life. Um, but pieces like this, and I think Quartet for the End of Time, those pieces from right around the 30s, 40s, where he's still, you know, very much steeped in that French conservatory tradition. Very sort of lush harmonies, big singing melodies. Those are some of the great, sort of uh, gateway pieces of his that I recommend that people start with. And the other angle I recommend um, people coming at it from is, to me, um, and this might not be everybody's experience, but for me, out of any any composer of sacred music, um, Messiaen to me always captured the sort of inscrutability and unknowableness of a lot of the biblical imagery and themes the most honestly. Because, you know, I like Bach as much as anybody else, but I think Messiaen, he took it a step further and he imagined that God's music would sound pretty different from human
Yeah,
music, right? Um, and I think that's a lot closer to how it, how it might actually play out.
there's real
Um,
mystery, I think,
Absolutely.
in his sound, and maybe even it's something that's not meant to be easy listening, but
No,
it's
it's and he
like,
was very very clear about that. He had this concept in his music that he called the charm of impossibilities, um, and it's just making use of these contradictions almost, and this inscrutability and um, things that don't quite make sense. Um, but there's that mystery to it. Um, and yeah, it's um, there's that esoteric element that underpins pretty much everything he ever wrote. That there's there's that barrier to understanding that it's not actually possible for a person to cross. It's that idea underpins his theology and his musical thinking, and a very, very important way of thinking. So the upshot is I think if you go into Messiaen's music with the expectation that you're not going to necessarily understand it right away, and that you're not necessarily supposed to understand it, and that's what he's trying to communicate. I think that's a good sort of philosophical approach.
Yeah, I mean, anything worthwhile like this, may take a little effort,
Right.
and that's okay. I was really glad you talked about melody and the French sort of tradition of composers like Ravel and so on, who are
Mm-hmm.
just a kind of a generation before Messiaen. And this French conservatory atmosphere is coming back to this piece. I played it in 2015, and now coming back to it 5 years later with all the experiences in between. I right now I don't have to worry about kind of deciphering the notes on the page, or finding the mathematical relationships between different rhythms and so on. Like, a lot of that work already was happened at the time that I learned the piece, and now I find I can think a little bit more about the phrasing and a little bit more of the big picture. And I'm finding all of these sort of lush romantic phrasings. The harmonies don't sound particularly romantic all the time, but there is still this core of really expressive and communicative phrasing, and just trying to bring that out has been one of my challenges with this go around.
Yeah, it's interesting. That idea of phrase structure and form is something that he talks about a lot in that book. More so even than some of the stuff you'd expect him to talk about, like birdsong,
Mm-hmm.
or non-retrogradable rhythms, or not to get too technical, but yeah, his at least in that early period of his life, and to an extent throughout the rest of his life too, he had a very sort of traditional way of looking at phrasing and form, and it's always very sort of clear and classical, and I think that's one of the things that makes his music, even some of the more experimental stuff, it makes it more approachable than some of your other more stereotypical high modernist composers like Boulez or Stockhausen, or people of that generation. Because even when he's getting very, very avant-garde and very experimental, it's so clearly sectioned off and organized into these digestible chunks that it becomes a lot more a lot easier to absorb.
As a composer, or how do you think about Messiaen's organ works versus his maybe non-organ works, either chamber music or orchestral? Do you find
There are no
different
non-organ works.
experience to listen to one or the other?
There's no such thing as a non-organ work by Messiaen. I'm serious. Like, his experience as an organist informed every single thing he ever wrote, and yeah, just his whole sense of melody and harmony and color and texture and everything is just steeped in his experience as an organist, which after all was his longest lasting job.
Right,
Was
60 years at the same church.
right as the organist. Was it 60 years? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was. I think it was like 32 to 81 or something.
Something like,
No,
yeah.
no, 32 to 91, or something. 59, 60 years.
I know he only retired a couple years before he died. Yeah,
Yeah, it was
but yeah,
right
he
at the
was the
very end.
organist at the Église de la Sainte Trinité for decades, and that was really the core of his musicality. The only weirdly enough, he only ever wrote one piece that was intended for use as a liturgical music. and it's an organ piece. It's the Pentecost Mass, which is weirdly enough one of his weirdest pieces.
I know.
But it's all based on the improvisations that he did
Right.
as an organist as part of these church services. So,
And he was almost
but
alone among 20th century composers in having, modernist composers in having this kind of weekly Sunday church job. It was,
yeah,
and he didn't treat it as like a backwater that he only did to make ends meet.
yeah,
He really poured his heart and soul into his work in the church.
yeah. I mean, I've always thought that to go back to the Bach comparison, I've always thought that Messiaen is the closest parallel we have to Bach. Um, but just in terms of looking at his non organ compositions, I find it's usually helpful to look at them through the lens of him being a professional organist, um, and you really start to hear it. You really start to hear it in the ways, particularly the ways he orchestrates for winds. Very, 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 very organ flavored, um, especially in some of that later music.
And having like different layers going on, you can kind of split out things. The right hand versus left hand
Yeah,
versus pedal,
absolutely. His whole sense of polyphony and
the
everything
different
is,
divisions of the organ and like the location and space, like that all translates to his orchestral writing, I think.
yeah. Which is interesting that he never really played around too much with like spatialization of instruments and ensembles, which is something that a lot of his students did. Um, didn't really seem to interest him. I'm not sure why, but
But definitely the sort of layering of rhythms on top of each other. You see that in Nativité. There are moments where something will cycle, and you'll have the right hand will play one kind of mostly repeating passage, and the left hand another, and the pedal a third, and it'll just sort of cycle through. And it's really an image of timeless space and contemplation, and that's something you see a lot in his non-organ. Quote unquote. But in his orchestral writing, like in
yeah,
Tarantula, you see the same thing, just for orchestral instruments.
yeah, and so much of that's again another thing that ties back into his theological understanding is that his concept of God, which again comes from Aquinas, is as existing beyond sort of space and time, beyond a human conception of space and time, and that's something that he tried to capture in a lot of his music was this non-linearity, non-time orientedness, and see, without getting too technical, there's a whole lot of nitty gritty musical things that he does to achieve that, and one of them is this just having these comparatively static layers. Just kind of passing in and out of each other in different ways and never really going anywhere, just kind of existing. But yeah, absolutely.
That not going anywhere. It's so counterintuitive for a modern listener to think about not just existing. I mean, it kind of ties into some concepts of spirituality and meditation that maybe are a little more familiar to a contemporary listener, but the idea of just really being truly still and not necessarily expecting there to be a big arrival point or a denouement. Sometimes there
Mm-hmm.
might be, but sometimes you're just supposed to exist in the space and think yourself about what you're feeling, what you're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a very different way of going about life, and you have to kind of carve out a space for that kind of thought.
Right. And so much of it, again, so much of it is tied to, not just the narrative and the rhythm of a church service, but the narrative and the rhythm of the church calendar. You keep cycling through the same themes and ideas and just revisiting them year after year after year and coming at them from different angles and new contexts with current events and et cetera. And it's the same thing with Messiaen's music. You just cycle back to the same ideas, and every time you hear it, it's new. It's obviously the same material, but you're looking at it in it from a different direction, and yeah, yeah, you can tie basically anything with Messiaen back to his faith.
Certainly 5 years later, performing for the second time, I'm coming at it from a different place than I
Sure.
was at the first time.
Well, yeah, how could you not?
I think like most great music, it really you always keep finding new things in it
Hmm.
and finding new little bits of detail.
Absolutely.
I've been keeping a blog over the last few days. It's 10 movements in the concert. Nativité has 9, and then I'm prefacing it with one additional movement, which is the Apparition de l'Église éternelle, or
That's
the
right.
appearance of the eternal church. So there are 10 movements in this concert, and over the last 10 days, I've sort of blogged one movement per day, and I've thought a little bit about the meaning behind some of this music. And yeah, things have occurred to me even in writing that I didn't necessarily hadn't really crystallized for me before. So I think it's just something that I will be coming back to my whole life, and it will be an eternal process for me to revisit this and come to new understanding of it.
Yeah, of course. And Messiaen's just one of those composers that every time you come back to a piece, you hear something new, or you understand something new, or it's very, very, fertile kind of music like that.
So thank you very much, Max, for this conversation. If you would like to purchase tickets to tonight's concert, they are available on the Cathedral website. It's also in the Facebook event description. So join us at 7 tonight for La Nativité du Seigneur and the Apparition de l'Église éternelle. The concert will last about an hour and 10 minutes, and it will be quite an experience. This has been pre-recorded in the cathedral, and I encourage you to just really sit back and relax and let yourself enter into this timeless contemplative space, and just to let the music wash over you. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon, have a great evening, and hopefully check out the concert tonight. Thanks very much for watching.